Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Shannon Powell, one of the directors of No Surrender New York. We're so excited and honored to have Dr. Evelyn Farkas with us. Evelyn was also one of our earliest supporters, and we're here today in great part because of her belief in us and our mission. Evelyn is a native New Yorker and a former congressional candidate in New York 17. Evelyn is currently president of Farkas Global Strategies and was previously a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the US and the Atlantic Council. Evelyn served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, and the Balkans under President Obama. Wow. Thanks, Evelyn, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It's so great to have you.
I am Tom Watson, one of the co-directors of No Surrender New York. I just wanted to take a quick minute to update everybody on where we are with redistricting, which was the news item of this past week. We're not going to focus on it here tonight, but it was an important week, and it was an important week for No Surrender New York. As most of you will undoubtedly have seen, the proposed congressional maps are out, and we stand to pick up 3 districts with an additional Republican loss in our state. We will share some of the coverage later on in the chat, so you can click on it and visit our website and look at that. We still have to go out and win these districts. This is just step one, but one of the things that our PAC did was lobby pretty hard to maximize the potential of the redistricting process. So many of us worked hard to get the Democrats into a supermajority in our state. So now the real work starts. So I just wanted to open with that. And also to say, as we go on, we'll be fielding questions. Please, if you have a question, drop it in the chat and we'll try to keep track of it and then ask Evelyn or call on some folks later. But building on what I was just talking about, Evelyn, tonight's event, we named it Defending Democracy. And that's because in so many conversations with you, and Evelyn's one of our earliest supporters, we keep coming back to that, to the importance of doing just that at this time in history. That's what our PAC is about. That's why you support it. What, if you don't mind telling everybody tonight, what does defending democracy mean to you?
So first of all, thank you, Shannon, Tom, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you to Vera and others who I know are co-hosting. You know, New York is near and dear to my heart because New York is where democracy began for my family. My parents fled communist Hungary in 1956. Many of you who had to endure my campaign speeches when I ran for Congress know that my mother left with only a sandwich in her pocket. And it's true. And so, you know, I was born here, but very much aware that there was an alternative to democracy because that was where my grandparents lived. And when I went there as a 10-year-old, I was told to be careful because I might say the wrong thing because the lady next door is a spy for the government and I could get my grandparents in really big trouble. And I understood somehow that really big trouble meant like police come and take them away. So, you know, for me, it starts with my childhood, obviously. But, you know, growing up in America, I think a lot of us, first of all, there was the Cold War. So for those of us who are old enough to remember that, we were in this kind of existential struggle. And so we didn't really think much about our way of life. We knew we were fighting to preserve it against this communist bloc. But in the aftermath of the Cold War, I think a lot of people kind of just took democracy for granted, didn't realize that each one of us individually has to do something to keep it going. Which is a lot of why I really commend No Surrender New York. And I'm happy to, you know, talk about why I think that's important. This effort is important as well. But, you know, we didn't realize that we all have to put in work almost every day, not just voting, but just being active citizens. And then we didn't realize how fragile our democracy is until we had ultimately a culmination, I think, of many factors, lots of dynamics that resulted in Donald Trump, a president who, somebody needs to mute, who is decidedly undemocratic, right? That might be my parents. That might be my, and if that's the case, I apologize.
I got it.
But they're 96 and 83, so they get a pass. Anyway, so I think, you know, ultimately for me, it really is and the only reason I ran for office was because I felt that even though I've been focused so much on the international arena and kind of trying to help other countries gain democracy and defending the rights of other people in other countries to have democracy, I mean, that was really for me professionally where I was most active. But I suddenly realized that we were not secure here in our democracy. So that's really kind of the shortest answer I could give you on that, Tom.
So, Evelyn, I want to follow up. Some American conservatives like Tucker Carlson are making pilgrimages to Hungary to praise Viktor Orban, an anti-democratic, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant leader. Trump endorsed him. What's the danger in that?
Oh, I mean, it's hugely dangerous because, again, giving lip service to these kinds of autocrats gives them a lot of cover for their actions. It helps those people who want to do business with them for economic reasons or ally themselves with them also for economic reasons, like Viktor Orban, frankly. It helps them, it gives them cover. And frankly, it means that we don't stand up to Vladimir Putin and other autocrats when they are threatening our democracy, or in the case of Ukraine, threatening the principle of democracy, which is the bedrock of the international system, in the sense that state sovereignty is enshrined in Article 2 of the UN Charter. And the reason for that is because we don't want world wars again over boundaries, over what is state sovereignty. And of course, it's never easy to finesse those issues. And we all, of course, ourselves have violated the sovereignty of other states. But what Russia has done in some, and certainly with regard to the annexation of Ukraine, is different, because that was the first time a country used military force in Europe to change boundaries by saying, we now own this piece of our neighbor. And the last time it was tried outside of Europe, frankly, to my knowledge, was 1990-91, when Saddam Hussein marched into Kuwait. And the international community, while they did have oil interests, they said, no, you can't change international boundaries using military force. So I think it's the principle of it. It's being really clear about what side you're on, what you stand for. And again, that's why I think No Surrender New York, even though we are a democratic state with a small d and a big D, you can't surrender the principles, you can't surrender the argument, and you have to be engaged in the dialogue, pointing out and educating your fellow citizens.
Yes, I mean, if we can bring it, that's a good segue. If you look at what's the rise of extremism in Hungary and elsewhere, given your experience in the State Department, et cetera, what are the things that you see on the American political scene that alarm you the most?
Well, right now, if I pick up the newspaper, I'm reading about the fact that President Trump, with the help of more than a handful of people, essentially was engineering a really well-conceived, multi-pronged coup against our Constitution and the people of the United States of America. This coup seems to have involved not just taking control of the Justice Department, and so having officials weigh in on behalf of the president and his cronies, but also local officials and his supporters hatching this plan, as we learned today, to seize voting machines in swing states. And then, of course, the very violent public attack on the Capitol. And I'm sure I'm leaving stuff out, because we don't all know. And what it gets me to is, this isn't, of course, the first time he assaulted our democracy. We still have the Russia story not completely told. And the reason we're weak, and well, I don't want to preempt what questions you might ask me about Russia, but the Russians have a piece in all of this as well. And so I'm really alarmed just reading the newspapers, because if Donald Trump could have almost done that, hatched a plan where they got so close, where they almost murdered members of Congress and took over the reins of government, it's not that hard to imagine that a smarter, frankly, group of people could engineer such a thing again. So democracy is really fragile. And I don't, they say you never repeat history, but it rhymes, so of course, Vladimir Putin isn't isn't Hitler and Donald Trump isn't Hitler, but these are autocratic, neo-fascists, and they're using nationalism, radical nationalism, and us versus them, racism, as you said earlier, Tom or Shannon, sexism, and of course, anti-Semitism. And so these things, it's incredibly dangerous. So all of that worries me.
Building on that a little bit, what about the rise of extremism? I mean, you talked a little bit about Trump and even, the January 6th and the voting machines, but what else are you seeing about the rise of it across the country here at home that concerns you?
So, what concerns me is, I think as a New Yorker, I always thought we were special, and I was kind of smug in I'm a Northerner. And so, the slavery problem, racism, that was more, not that we didn't, of course, we all acknowledge we had racism in the North, but we always felt like, oh, somehow it wasn't as bad as in the South. And then I just read Colin Woodard's book called Union. And it's amazing, like all the history we didn't learn, including about Woodrow Wilson, it's jaw dropping. All the racism, the slavery in New York as well. And so this extremism also exists in New York. And the crazy thing is, as I was reading, I'd get the patch and I'd read this guy from Rockland and that guy from Westchester. Of course, they're all guys. And then I looked at what social scientists said about this. And this does, again, it relates. I'm doing another ad for you guys because it relates to what you're trying to do to shore up democracy in New York, because the people who are the leaders of Proud Boys and these weird groups, many of them come from blue states or from communities that were largely white and now are no longer white. And they're trying to find their way and they don't really belong. I hate to call people losers, but they feel like they're losers. At least they have grievances. And so they are the people who are actually leading these groups. They're not, radical fundamentalist religious people, or Midwestern, Southern, whatever you want to think in your mind's eye. They're actually your neighbors.
Right. That indeed they are. And I just want to say, Gavin McGinnis, the founder of the Proud Boys, lives in my hometown of Larchmont and is from Canada.
I was thinking of that. I wasn't going to say it, but.
Yes, indeed. So, do you think that again, the rise in extremism makes us more vulnerable to having, these domestic terrorism incidents here?
Yes. And this is all fueled really by social media. I watched a program about democracy. This was in the global context. Maria Ressa got an award together with a Russian journalist whose name I'm not going to remember. They got I think it was the Nobel Prizes last year, and they were being interviewed. And Maria Ressa is very clear about the role of social media in heightening and creating differences among us. And I really think it's going to be a long time before we can recover from that. I do hope that we do, but the other issue is, of course, the downfall or the loss of local media. So local journalism, because when your local journalist is running around writing stories, that person, they're putting names in the stories, people right? So you can't dismiss it as fake news. So there are a lot of trends in our kind of social communications environment that are negative, that I hope we can change. And those are things that like everyone on this in these little boxes can contribute to. You can buy your local paper, you can contribute money even to your local paper. A lot of papers are really nonprofits for all intents and purposes. In the old days, wealthy families would run them. That's still the case in some places.
Right.
That actually raises a point that I would love to ask you about, Evelyn, and that is when you look at and given your foreign policy background, you look at the rise of extremism, you look at what we were just talking about, which is kind of white nationalism, and the fact that we have it here, and it's become a virulent strain here, and does empower these autocrats elsewhere, right? The extremism and bigotry, authoritarianism, making one group of people the other is all part of the tactics. But what we actually had a session on this. One of the problems with our media writ large in this country is that it tends to both sides everything, so that we have what has become an extremist Republican Party for the most part, with a pretty occasionally wishy-washy Democratic Party, shall we say? And those are wildly different things, and yet it's precise. Here's one side, the Proud Boys, and here's the other side, Democrats failed to pass bill. What is your what is your take on that, and how does that play into this moment that we're all kind of going through?
So I agree with you. I think there's something called truth and there are facts. And so you can't say, well, the people who don't want to take, for example, I mean, I don't want to get too far into COVID stuff, but people who don't want to take the vaccine against COVID-19 they have a point that it could harm you. No, I mean, it's a very, very, very low probability that it would harm you. You can't compare that with the reality that it saved so many lives. So I think there are truths, and the journalists, by and large, on COVID, actually, they've done a decent job, regular journalism. But on other things, you're right. And I think that they need to be called out for that. There was a really good column in the Washington Post. Of course, I won't remember her full name, Margaret. And she wrote about this. She said that journalistic standards should actually, journalists should be rated according to how well they help defend democracy. So, and again, that comes back to truth and what are our values. I think it's obviously hard, who polices, but I think the consumers ultimately can decide. And if you choose to tune in to, far left or far right, then that's your contribution to society.
Evelyn, you talked a little bit about the latest Trump news and the voting machines. Just on the whole, how do you feel that this investigation into what happened with the insurrection with 1-6 is going?
Actually, I want to pause for a minute, though, because I don't think the far left is the same as the far right. So I didn't mean to make them equivalent. I just mean where are you going to more
for your news? Yeah,
for the truth. Let me just leave it at that, because I started to contradict myself. On the issue of how they're doing, it looks like they've gotten a lot of evidence up on the Hill, which means, of course, I can only imagine the Justice Department has access to all of that as well, if not more. And certainly they've been rounding up a lot of the lower level people. I think I share most people's most Democrats' impatience. We need action. I was one of those people who thought that justice would prevail with both impeachments and the Russia Mueller investigation, but I hold on to my optimism, because that's the only way I can continue to contribute to our democracy. So I think they're doing a great job getting the information they need. And it seems that you always need a couple key people from the other side, as we know from the Nixon case, who will testify to, first person, they were in the room, provide the evidence that's required. And it looks like they are getting that, certainly from the Pence camp, as we learned today.
Yeah, a lot of things to be a lot of things to worry about. We do have a lot of great questions, so we can maybe start to get to some of those. Let's see. We're going to try and call Deborah. You want to ask your question? I know Deborah's here. Deborah has a question. I can read it or you can ask it. Deborah,
okay, I'll ask it. Yeah, sure. I'll be happy.
Okay, great. Go ahead. Have at it.
Thank you
Deborah.
so much for coming, Evelyn. I was just wondering, the right wing keeps saying over and over again, why do we have to go and get involved in this little country far away, Ukraine? Why is it even in the United States' interest to care? Can you answer that talking point?
Yeah. So first of all, we're not sending your sons and daughters to go fight on the front line in Ukraine. what we're doing is continuing work that we've been doing since they were invaded in 2014 under the Obama administration, and indeed even under the Trump administration, although as we all know, he held up about $250 million of assistance to try to bribe the Ukrainian president, for which he was impeached. But even his administration had a policy of supporting Ukraine militarily, economically, and politically. And why does it matter? Because when Ukrainians went to the street in 2014, they had decided that they wanted to join the European Union, and their leader, who was the Moscow-controlled leader, had dithered back and forth, EU or Moscow. Really, he just didn't want to make a choice, but ultimately you're either in the EU or you're not, because there are stringent requirements. It requires a real capitalist economy, not crony kleptocracy like you have in Russia. So the Ukrainian leader, controlled by Putin, said, you know what, we're not going to do the European Union. Well, the Ukrainians went to the streets, and a lot of it was young people who saw their neighbor Poland, which had historically been not as rich as Ukraine and not as large. And the Ukrainians realized, wait a minute, they're way better off than we are, and they're part of this EU and have the Nato umbrella, et cetera, so security umbrella, which allows investment. So they went to the streets. Of course, the Russia-backed guy killed over 100 people. He fled the country. We worked with Russia and the European Union to engineer a transition government. The Ukrainians voted. They wanted a democratic government. They voted for one government, and then the next government, which is the current government, this comedian who was elected on an anti-corruption platform. So Ukraine is struggling to defend its democracy, but the Ukrainian people were shocked when in 2014, in response to their decision to boot the Kremlin-supported guy and their decision to hold elections, President Putin seized Crimea. And like I said, he essentially said, this is no longer part of Ukraine, we annex it, which again is completely illegal under international law and is very Hitlerian, World War II sphere of influence kind of behavior. So the issue is that Putin wants to control Ukraine. He wants it back under his sphere of influence. Why? Because Vladimir Putin sees a democratic Ukraine as an alternative model to his people. And he doesn't want his people kicking him out and choosing democracy. Same thing with Belarus. There were demonstrations last year, some of you might remember, in Belarus. He helped the leader in Belarus put those down. Same things more recently in Kazakhstan. So he wants a sphere of influence where all the political economic system is controlled by him and no one can threaten his regime. And that's the same for the cronies around him. Now, NATO has a rule that if you apply and you make the criteria, we can consider you for membership. And in the case of Ukraine and another country occupied by occupied by Russia, the Republic of Georgia, NATO said they can join. But they have to meet the criteria. And we're actually in a period of compromise. We've been in a period of compromise since they were told they could join, because they haven't been admitted in, because they have a lot of work to do, but also there is, frankly speaking, concern about Russia. So now I'll get really quickly to the point of why it gets to our backyard. If we just say, take Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is the type of leader who will turn around and say, okay, great, I want my sphere of influence. Where else is there a threat to me that's nearby? And where else did I have a sphere of influence before? Well, he will look at the Baltic states, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. And when we do military exercises against the likely threat from Russia, it's cyber attacks and, little green irregular special forces crossing into Estonia or one of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and creating some kind of security issue where maybe Putin then marches in with conventional forces, or he doesn't, but he's effectively attacked a NATO ally. And if the NATO allies don't come to the aid of those Baltic states, then NATO falls apart. And the whole premise, the whole reason we have peace and stability in Europe right now is because of NATO. Because Viktor Orban, he would like a piece of Ukraine because there are Hungarians living in Ukraine, and there are Hungarians in Romania, and there are Hungarians in Slovakia, and all those old things from your history books, they're not old to those Europeans. And they would fight about them again if it weren't for the system we set up after World War II. So it's a long answer, and it sounds like I'm a social studies teacher, but that's the reality. If we don't stick up for Ukraine now, there's a danger that we'll literally have to fight because of Article 5 requirements to defend NATO countries. And again, if you don't defend Europe, he'll come after us next.
Before I go to another question from the audience, I want to just ask you about some of Ukraine's neighbors. Some of these Eastern European countries like Hungary and Poland are now led by some of these anti-democratic, people. How concerned are you about this as well?
Well, my concern is limited by the fact that Viktor Orban also does a lot of business with Germany, and he likes the EU subsidies that he's been getting so far. So he's the weakest link, I would say. I mean, he was just in Moscow meeting with Putin, right. Trying to have it both ways. The Poles are close behind, but the Poles, they have much more, history of being overrun by Russian forces, military forces. And so it's a weird dance they're playing because they're nationalistic and they're agreeing with Putin on a lot of things about how to control domestically, but they're not quite as bad as Orban. So I am worried because, again, we democracies ultimately we have to start with shoring up our own democracies. So that goes for here too. And Russia, exacerbated existing tensions we had, and so did social media. But at the end of the day, if we want to defend our democracy, we, along with our European allies, also have to have a strategy that includes strengthening our democracy at home. Because if we are strong here, we can be stronger to support others, and we can withstand Putin.
Thank you for that. Margaret, you had a question. Do you want to ask it directly of Evelyn? Margaret Bradbury?
So many Margarets. Yes, happy to. Yeah, so my question was, I was thinking about, I guess, like 3.5 years ago when Trump and his minions were like praising Putin and calling him, well, he's an effective leader, yada, yada. And then, there was a time where you couldn't swing a dead cat without hitting somebody in Congress that had some weird ties to oligarchs in Russia. Do you have any insight as to where those links still are? And especially as we think about our mission right now, which is to get rid of the radical right, are there actual links between Russian oligarch financing and some of the people running for Congress, either in New York, probably not so much, or others, or senators?
Yeah, so the answer is probably, but I don't have the forensic evidence. So there was a recent case that was decided. It may have been in New York because that was where Trump had his campaign headquarters, that found that there were that foreign funds were used to purchase tickets to the Trump inaugural, and those foreign funds likely included a lot of Russian funds, because we do know some of that from the Mueller report and from the really good reporting coming out of the Washington Post and the New York Times, a couple of years ago. So my guess is there's still that kind of funding, and there are some oligarchs who we deem as kind of acceptable, maybe because they have dual citizenship. There are think tanks who get money from Russian sources. So they're not all sanctioned, even these oligarchs, and some of them are close to Putin. This is a huge problem in London, where you also have a lot of real estate purchased by Russians close to Putin. We have that problem in Florida and New York and elsewhere, although Congress has been working to pass legislation on transparency to combat that. But yes, so in short, I mean, look, money is a problem in our electoral system, in our democracy in general. But we have seen that foreign actors, especially the Russians, have been really good at exploiting that.
All right, Mika, I think you have a question. Do you want to ask it of Evelyn? Mika?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. You got to part of my question already with your discussion of sort of the background to the Ukraine crisis. But I was hoping that you might take us a little bit further through what President Biden has been doing so far, and I guess how you said we're not going to, our troops aren't going to be over there fighting, but we all know from the history of war and wars in Europe in particular that things can escalate, things can get out of hand. So could you take us through how you think this crisis could be resolved peacefully And what are your concerns about the risk of it escalating and turning into something far more dangerous?
So thank you for the question, because that is really what's on top of my mind today when I think about the world and democracy in the global context. Putin really, he's got a gun to the head of Ukraine, but it's really a gun, as I said, to the head of the international order, because if we let him get away with what he's doing in Ukraine, he will try to get a sphere of influence, which means the UN system and all those rules about borders not being changed will be down the toilet, and we'll be back to pre-World War II. So we don't want that. That's really dangerous, because then it's dog eat dog, economic, political competition. Smaller states have no say. We're sticking up for a small state, relatively speaking, although it's not that small. So, to answer your question, I really believe that the Biden administration has struck the right balance between a firm approach and extending a hand of democracy. What we've gotten wrong, frankly, from the Bush administration, when in 2008 the Russians seized, as I said, this 20% of the Republic of Georgia, and stayed there, all the way through the Obama administration and the Trump administration, is that we have not been firm enough with Putin, and that includes the Europeans, because I can't even give you, I can't even keep in my head the list of all the horrific, international law-breaking things the Russians have done. But, let me just name a few, like downing the MH17 airliner over the Ukrainian skies in July of 2014, where 300 people just went right to their death. They fired a missile at it. Now, granted, and it was a Russian missile, they may have thought it was not a passenger airplane, but nevertheless, they did it. They lied about it. They poisoned, using weapons of mass destruction, like not just some cheap arsenic, polonium, and then the agent that they used to try to kill Alexei Navalny, also the Novichok agent. They've done that in multiple countries, so it's like extraterritorial killing. I believe they actually killed also Mikhail Lesin here in Washington, D.C. And there are many more things, as you know, that they have done that have broken international laws. We need to stand up to Vladimir Putin. The only way, there's a Russian saying, I don't even know if it's just Russian, but that, if you plunge the knife in and it feels soft, keep going. So, if you feel no resistance and you're someone like Putin who has maximalist goals, pretty ambitious goals, you just keep going. And that's why I think the administration's got the right policy. So let me just quickly sum up what that is. It's, first of all, telling the Russians ahead of time, because we weren't so good at this in the past, also, I say, as a member of the Obama administration, telling the Russians ahead of time, if you march in with one more foot or one more cyber act into Ukraine, then you will see these sanctions. And I've been told by administration officials that they've been more direct with the Russians about what to expect. They don't do it publicly because they don't need the journalists asking them a million questions about it, and trying to find daylight between allied countries. But certainly they've told the Russians the range of what to expect using some specific examples. So that should make them stop and think. That's supposed to deter them. That alone, I know, and I believe is not sufficient. And many other experts agree with me. The second thing we're doing is continuing to arm the Ukrainians and hopefully arm them better. I know that we're giving them more javelins, so more missiles that they can launch at the Russians coming over the berm, but I don't think we've given them enough air defense or enough maritime support. If that changes, then that will be really important deterrent, because the Russians really can control the skies right now, which is dangerous. Dangerous because it's tempting for them to go in and think they can have a clean victory. Now, they can't have a clean victory because at the end of the day, the Ukrainians are really so united. If they were not nationalistic, and they weren't, a lot of them weren't in the Russian-speaking areas in the East, they were not very Ukrainian in consciousness. But after Russia invaded, they felt so angry that the level of nationalism has risen across the country. The third piece of the deterrent, so again, economic sanctions, arming and supporting the Ukrainians and their military. The third piece is to basically, well, actually, there are probably 4 pieces. Shore up NATO deterrent. So again, make sure Putin is not tempted to overreach and to do something that would be a miscalculation and could, as you said, as you mentioned, could lead to, an exchange of kinetic exchange, as they say in the military, between Russia and NATO forces. So to beef up NATO forces, and this is being done, right now, especially in response to the new deployments in Belarus, which shares borders with Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Finally, the last part, I had written an op-ed in Defense One recently calling for this, and I'm excited to see it, although I think there's more that can be done, so that I have another op-ed coming out soon on it. But we went to the UN and we started a diplomatic pressure campaign against Vladimir Putin, and I think that's really necessary. Now, is that gonna win the day? It's probably gonna have less impact than the others, but I think it contributes in a meaningful way. It puts the pressure on the Russian government. If they go visit somewhere in Africa and they want to build a road, somewhere that African leader up until now wasn't really thinking about what are these Russians doing far away. Now, well, their ambassador was forced to listen in the UN, and hopefully they'll be forced to vote if God forbid Russia takes further action. And even with regard to the past, I think we need to put in place some kind of mechanism through the UN to address Russia's occupations of Georgia, of Ukraine and the Donbass, and then also Crimea.
All right, thank you, Evelyn. Larry May had a question too. It's a little bit of a follow-up to the Russians and the UN. Larry, you want to ask your question? Larry?
There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, all righty. Yeah, I was asking Evelyn, do you think there's any veracity to the Russian UN ambassador and Putin himself implying that the US and NATO military buildup is willing a confrontation to happen rather than deterring war?
No, I mean, first of all, the Ukrainians, it's like their worst nightmare because they cannot stand up. They will lose so many lives, and they lost so many in 2014. They can't stand up to the Russian might by themselves, and we haven't given them enough weaponry to do so, and we also don't want to encourage them. We want them to defend themselves. This is why I really wish we would give better strategic air defense systems and maritime support to Ukraine. But the Ukrainians for sure don't want this. And of course, they're trying to keep their cool. There's been a lot made in our press about the fact that President Biden is worked up and says there's going to be likely some kind of military action against Ukraine, and the Ukrainian president is chill. Well, that the Ukrainian president is trying not to completely tank his economy or get his people to flee the country or have his government collapse, because that's part of Putin's endgame as well, or another way that he could achieve his objective. Because ultimately, he doesn't need the territory; he just needs the government in Kiev to say, okay, I'll do whatever you want, mercy. So I now lost my train of thought, but and then for us, we don't want any kind of conflict with Russia, and that goes for all of the allies. The ones closest to Russia are most nervous, but they want us to show, put up a good deterrent show. The ones further west, I mean, they want their oil and gas to be coming from Russia. Germany gets about 60% of its natural gas from Russia. So there's no desire, there's no appetite for war, but, it's just gotten to the point where, it's not just gotten to the point, let me put it this way. Vladimir Putin decided now, and that has to do with our domestic weakness and our leaving Afghanistan, but he decided now to take this escalatory action. And he did it right out in the open. I mean, it's like he came with a cannon, in front of, Tom and Shannon's houses, and said, hey, I want you to make a deal with me about something, he's doing it out in the open. So it's really, the international community has to respond.
Right.
All right, I'm going to go to Kim Israeli next. Kim, thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Larry. Kim, who is also one of the co-hosts of today's fundraiser. Go ahead, Kim.
Oh, good evening. A little different question here. In countries where all residents are required to vote, there's a built-in preservation of democracy. I think you'd agree. Should we be moving to requiring all residents to vote? And are there any examples of countries we could follow?
Well, I think in Australia, right, they have a requirement to vote, if I remember correctly. I think I would stop short of a full-on requirement to vote, only because I think that you should have the right to not vote. Having said that, we do everything in our country to make it hard to vote, with the exception, I would say, of during the pandemic. We did a better job, including in New York, making a lot of other options available for people.
I can bring this in there.
Sorry? Oh, but now, of course, we see the backlash, frankly, the white nationalist backlash in the southern states, primarily, where they are trying to curtail people's access to the ballot box. But I think we should have a holiday, for election day. People should, we should provide rides and food. And, in the old days, it used to be like family day, and people would go vote and they would have picnics. And so I think there's so many obvious things we can do to make it easier for people to vote. But having said that, you also want to educate people, because part of having, encouraging people to vote is you also want people to educate themselves so that they are responsible citizens and they make good choices, they make informed choices. So we also have to ramp up our educational system to include our civic education.
All right, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to now ask Jacqueline. Jacqueline, you have a question for Evelyn?
Yeah, I did. Thank you. One of the things that concerns me just about the stability of the country has been the kind of frayed line between the military and law enforcement and the militia groups. And there seems to be kind of a very fluid interchange between them. And, should somebody like DeSantis or should the Republicans take back the White House, or even just on a local level, when it comes to defending elections and poll workers at the state and local level, that seems like a really great concern to me. And I read about, DOD kind of investigating, and it just doesn't feel like there's been, what do we do about that? And what are your thoughts?
I think the answer lies in these investigations. So the January 6th investigations on the Hill and in the Justice Department. And then, the military itself, clearly they knew the rules of the road. And, luckily, up until almost the end, you had a Secretary of Defense who understood what was at stake and didn't cave. But then there's some question about what happened in those last days under the last regime, in the Pentagon. And so I think we need those questions answered. And then that's where Congress steps in and strengthens the rules. And I am heartened by the fact that right now, I don't know if they're going to address the role of security entities in elections or in public security, but I'm heartened by the fact that there is a bipartisan group right now in Congress and in the Senate, working on an electoral reform package. I think that's really important, and I would like to see these things get passed really quickly, because I just worry with the latest news of one of our Democratic senators unfortunately having a stroke, and we need to move more quickly on legislation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Evelyn. John Greco has a question now. John, I'll go to you.
Thank you. Hi, Evelyn. How are you?
Good. How are you, John? Great to see you.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Washington. Evelyn, I'm
He's a New Yorker. He's an original New Yorker.
born in Pelham Bay, the Bronx.
Oh, perfect.
That's right. And from Westchester. Evelyn, I'm so fascinated by the psychology behind this drift towards authoritarianism that we're seeing, not just in this country, but in the West, and in the West generally, and not just Hungary, but the UK. I didn't take Trump seriously until Brexit. And I still didn't think Trump would win, but I started to take him as more than, you know, this facetious threat. Talk about the psychology behind Americans longing for a past that never really was, kind of the way Soviet era pensioners think about Stalin wistfully. Where does that come from, and how do you see that playing out in this country and the West in general?
I mean, it makes me think, John, of stuff I learned at the Fletcher School, where you and I both attended, on ethnic conflict, because it comes down to, I talked earlier about these guys in Westchester and Rockland who don't know where they belong. And a lot of it has to do with feeling like you don't belong anymore. And under those old systems, you knew where you belonged. And so even if you had to wait in line for bread in the Soviet system for 6 hours, there was predictability in it, and you knew what your status was, and you had reconciled yourself to it. But in a world where everything's uncertain and you don't know where you rank in the hierarchy, and you think that you're falling in your ranking, people reach for these extremist positions based on like a fake nostalgia, because they didn't even have it that good, in the old days, right? And certainly a lot of other people suffered. So I think that's what explains it. It's just a insecurity, and we are in a period of a lot of change. And I say this before our Earth has actually melted and frozen and whatever, all those horrible things that are going to happen to it, because that's still coming. I mean, that's actually probably ultimately how we're going to end up getting along with Vladimir Putin, when his tundra, his frozen tundra is now, I mean, this is true, like on fire, and he needs to call us for help, and whatever, like the globe will only become united in the face of the horrible catastrophe that's coming, which is an overly Pollyannish view of it, because there's going to be actually a lot of warfare created by this turmoil, environmentally speaking, in terms of resources. But even before we get there, we're in a world of change, and people are uncomfortable. And certainly, it's not just in the US context. You have a lot of refugee flows. And so in Europe and the United States, where you had kind of dominant races or groups, now being less dominant, or it's being questioned. And certainly in the US, we will not have a majority white country like tomorrow. I don't know what the year is anymore, but those changes make people uncertain. The changes with technology and people losing jobs now because of technology. They already lost jobs because of offsourcing. And so I think just a lot of questions, existential questions, cause people, and then the lack also of an ideology that binds people. There's a lack of religion has seen an erosion. I guess real religion, I don't know. there is still fundamentalist religion. So the answer is very complicated, John. But I think it comes down to change. People are afraid of change, and if they start feeling like they're losers, losers, quote unquote, like they're not on the winning side of the change, then they start grasping for this nostalgia. I mean, I see it. If you read, I'll just say one more thing, another book plug. I'm sure a lot of you know about Isabelle Wilkerson and the books she wrote, looking at the African American or the Black experience in America. And the Caste book is, it's really well done, because she explains how people have this need. And again, I learned this in my ethnic conflict class. Group identity we just all need to have a group, and it's a human thing. But she explains how it impacted the United States, this caste identity, and also illuminates how America was so bad that the Nazis thought they couldn't actually do. They thought that it was made up, like some of the stuff that we did to Black Americans. So.
Yeah, that was a great book. Charles, we're going to go to you, Charles Levine. Charles, see if we can find Charles. He's here. All right. Okay, Charles, will come back to you. Well, Charles did have a question. I'll just go ahead and ask it. What do you think will happen to the Republican Party?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question.
That's why I picked it.
I mean, I think there are enough people who feel strongly about some Republican Party principles, like fiscal responsibility, conservative socially, but maybe meaning less radical change. I don't aspire to that. I don't understand that component of Republicanism, but of course there are people who are very traditional and don't want societal change or social change. I think the pragmatic Republicans of yore, like the Bushes, those people are still out there and they have the power to take back their country. See Liz Cheney, and many of them are patriotically willing to put themselves on the line. So I think that they will probably still want that label. I haven't seen them move to another label. I mean, they certainly have a lot of bad history, which is in that book, but they also have the Woodard book, but they also have Abe Lincoln, and so I think they'll probably try to hold on to that moniker, and they'll probably hope they can seize the power back from Donald Trump. I mean, that's what you see with Mitch McConnell. He's not a Trumpist. I don't like his policies either, but I can't say that he's not a Democrat with a small d.
All right, now I'm going to go to Deborah Porter. Deborah has a question. Deborah, I'm going to ask.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could comment about Germany's position with respect to the Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah, so Germany is an interesting situation because for, oh my gosh, I mean, what was it, almost 20 years, the Chancellor Merkel with the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, with its small Bavarian sidekick, was in power in Germany, and they had a very pragmatic approach to Russia, which was do business with Russia, but stand up to it when it's not being democratic. And it kind of worked, although to be honest, I would have liked them to be firmer and not so businessy, because it would have saved us a lot of aggravation. We wouldn't be here now, I believe. But the new government is a coalition government. The Social Democratic Party is at the head of that coalition, and the chancellor is a Social Democrat. Over time, the Social Democrats, their elected leaders who retired, some of them have been really co-opted by the Russian government, meaning they've been given seats on the boards of Russian oil and gas companies. And in fact, Gerhard Schroeder, former chancellor, is the godfather, or his daughter has Putin as a godfather. So they're very intertwined, and that they represent this kind of corrupt, let's get along and do business with Russia perspective. There is a perspective that's not corrupt, that's, I think, too optimistic, or what's the word I'm looking for, just not effective, which just says, let's just get along with Russia. But again, that's ignoring all the bad things Russia does. So I don't find that any less troubling than the corrupt one, in effect. The coalition has also the Greens in it. The Greens have been very strongly, it's a very interesting change, how they've changed over time. And they're very firmly against Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin and their policies. So right now, this current coalition, and there's a third party, I think it's the Freedom, the FDP, and they have made agreements among themselves about policy. They had a lot of hard work to do. And apparently one of those agreements said, we're not going to provide German weaponry to any foreign countries, or non-NATO countries maybe. And so that was a decision they made as part of their kind of coalition agreement. But Germany also, of course, has a history of wanting to not be engaged militarily because of their bad history in the lead up, in particular in World War II. So the Germans have said that they will support Ukraine, but they don't want to provide weapons to Ukraine. I would argue that in this instance, this is a case where, you know, Putin is basically doing the same kind of territorial grab stuff that Hitler did. It's kind of a nice opportunity to disavow that type of behavior, but they're not interested in doing that. I hope that they cut off this second direct gas pipeline between Russia and Germany called Nord Stream. The first one's was just Nord Stream. And then now the second one is called Nord Stream 2. They haven't turned it on yet. And it's likely to get sanctioned anyway, whether the Russians invade or not, because even what they're doing right now, putting a gun to the head of someone. I mean, I don't know any country where you'd get away with putting a gun to someone's head, and then even though you didn't shoot them, you can go about your business like nothing happened. Usually you get arrested by the police and something happens. So I would imagine they're going to get sanctioned for that anyway. That's a long answer to your question. Which really, the short version would be, it's a coalition trying to figure out its foreign policy. Let's see. I'm glad the chancellor's coming this week to talk to President Biden. That's a good sign.
Thank you, Evelyn. I just want to ask one last question. It's almost 8 o'clock. This is which went incredibly quickly. It's been such an interesting conversation. As we look at where we are in this country, are we doing enough to protect democracy here based on your experience with the world?
No. So I think more people who really care and are not corrupted should run for office. More people should volunteer to work in, you know, voting booths. More people should go to states where democracy is being challenged and offer to give rides to people. And I don't know how to secretly get them a sandwich in line, but, you know, do whatever we can to help people exercise their right to vote, educate people about the differences between democracy and no democracy, the differences between political parties, because right now that's what it's coming down to. I mean, the Republican Party stands for nothing except supporting Trump or blocking what the Democrats are trying to do, which right now is a lot to help the American people. You know, President Biden's done a lot, but there's a lot more that he wants to achieve. And I really do worry also about rollback for, you know, civil rights in America, especially having read about the Reconstruction in this book called Union and other good literature out there, understanding how you know, segregation was instituted to the extent that it was in America, you know, happened under Woodrow Wilson, you know, things that we were not taught in our history books, you know, speaking of self-determination, that's what he was known for. He wasn't known for all the racist things he did. So, so I think, you know, we all need to be alert, and we need to teach our children real history. We need to go and talk to our citizens. We need to volunteer. We need to contribute money to political parties until we can get politicians in office who will change the system so it's not run by money. What else? I mean, there's a whole list of things, you know, people can do. My sister sends out postcards for candidates or postcards for the DNC. You know, volunteering your time to just help in your community.
That's great.
And of course, helping No Surrender New York.
Perfect segue.
We are fighting for democracy after all.
Yes, we are. And again, thank you for your support. It's 8:02. So I know that this has been a wonderful conversation, but we don't want to have anybody stay on it much past an hour. Always seems to be the witching hour. So I do want to make sure that I thank Kim and Verena and Robbie, who are co-hosts, who help put this together and get people here. Again, thanks everyone who's on this call for supporting us. It means so much. We are fighting for democracy, and you know, it is a team sport. So we are all in this together. And again, thank you, Evelyn. It's always great to see you and hear you speak. It was a wonderful conversation. Thanks again, and everyone have a wonderful night.